So this presentation is one that I like to give to customers. It serves as a very high-level overview of AWS security and the best practices. So sorry about that. So if you have any experience, well, let me ask this. How many folks in the room have experience with Amazon Web Services or AWS? Nice, nice. How about AWS security? Very nice. Okay, cool. All right. Well, we're in a good place then. A lot of this may be a review for you. Some of this might be new to you, but ultimately, I hope that everybody should get something out of this. So we'll start with the high-level overview of AWS. So the AWS global infrastructure, 32 regions. I think it's actually another one just launched in Western Canada, I believe last week or 2 weeks ago. 102 availability zones, 550 points of presence, and 35 local zones. Most people ignore all this and they just go to US East 1. That's our largest region. A lot of US East 1 fans in the house, I see. All right, so our regions. Regions are comprised of multiple availability zones, which basically are clusters or groups of data centers. Depending on the region and the size depends on how many availability zones and centers exist within the particular availability zone, or AZ as we call them. So this is just the construct of availability zone. If, again, US East 1, everyone's favorite. And then finally, the concept of an AWS account. So this is going to be important because, as we will discuss in the best practices, the AWS account serves as a security boundary. It is the best security boundary for your AWS workload. So the AWS account itself, it is a container for all of your AWS services, as well as cost and billing. It also is a mechanism to enforce any types of limits, quotas, things of that nature. And then on the right is just an overview of like the types of services we have: compute, networking, storage. But I mean, again, there's 200 plus services. So with that, we're going to go into the shared responsibility model. If you've ever listened to anyone from AWS talk about security, 10 times out of 10 we'll have this discussion first because it's a really important one. So the shared responsibility model defines what AWS is responsible for securing versus what the customer is responsible for. So let's first start with the traditional on-prem model. This is the world that I came from. I think most folks started out in, where generally you're responsible for security of everything. From the hardware, if you're hosting it yourself, to the underlying software hypervisors, the applications, operating systems, and your data. You're responsible for all of it. Now, with AWS, it is considered a shared responsibility. So if you'll see here on the bottom, AWS is responsible for security of the cloud, whereas the customer is responsible for security in the cloud. So again, AWS, we manage the data centers, not me specifically, but AWS manages the data centers, the ping pipes and power, everything underneath, as well as the underlying compute storage database and networking underneath the hypervisor layer. From there, we give the customers suites of tools in order to secure everything above that. So the client operating system, the networking traffic within your VPC or virtual private cloud, and then the security of your any types of firewall appliances, and of course your applications, and then most importantly, the identity and access management of your particular AWS account. We'll talk about that and what that means here in a little bit. So if you have experience with AWS, you say, hey, Brandon, okay, that looks good, but there's a lot of services. That line moves a little bit, and that's absolutely right. So for our infrastructure services, the line is closer to the bottom as far as what AWS manages. And again, that is things like EC2, I would say would be the best example of this, right? Where the underlying, anything beneath the hypervisor, AWS manages security for, customer does everything above it. Container services, it moves up a little bit because again, some of that is abstracted away from the customer, so the line shifts. So also services like RDS, will fall in that nature. That's more of a managed service. It's our relational database service. And then finally, some extracted service. Amazon S3, for example, you have no means or mechanisms to patch the operating systems. AWS handles that completely. So that would be considered an extracted or an abstracted service where AWS is responsible for managing that.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
That particular slide, is that, I haven't seen this before, but I knew it existed. Is there a place to find that, a link to it?
Yes, absolutely. So,
Actually, you can find it later.
yeah, and I can actually, I'll share this, I can share the slide deck out after the call as well, or after the session, sorry. All right? Yes?
So when a customer has, say, personal data and they're done with their container or their database or their virtual machine, who's responsible for making sure that all that data is properly sanitized?
That's an excellent question. So, depending on the step of the process. So, for example, once you as the customer, you would own security of the data while it's active. Once you click the delete button on whatever the resource is done, AWS manages that. And we have an entire suite and catalog of media destruction, secure disposal processes that we will follow to make sure that that information is securely wiped. So that's something that you can actually validate, and we'll talk about that in a minute, on how you, if you want to get some more detail and say, okay, better than, Brandon said this, there's actually ways to validate that using the AWS compliance guides and AWS Artifact. You can actually download the compliance guides and you can see where the third-party auditors have validated we follow those controls. That's a great question. All right. Oh, wow. AWS compliance, yeah. So these are the AWS compliance certifications that we adhere to. And then you can take a look at the AWS compliance site. This is really handy because how do I say this? If you want to know if a particular AWS service or region is within scope of a compliance or regulatory standard, it is completely listed on the AWS compliance website. So that's really handy, and a perfect example of this would be something like FedRAMP, NIST 853, right? FedRAMP would apply to specific AWS regions, specifically the GovCloud regions, and then I think the US East, West, and Canada Central are within scope of that. Other regions like in Europe and Asia, they aren't within the scope of the FedRAMP certification. So you can actually take a look and see which services, if you have a compliance or regulatory requirement, for example, I used to do this a lot when I was responding to different types of RFPs or contracts doing federal work. You can say, hey, we're using S3 for this application. Is it in scope of this? If yes, we can proceed. Now you'll come to a point where if you are meeting with an auditor, an assessor, or any type of third-party body, and they want you to validate that AWS is doing these things, you can actually go within your AWS account. There's a free service called AWS Artifact. You can log in. There's dozens of different reports for regulations across the world, and you can actually download the actual artifact, which would be a report from the assessor saying, yes, for example, this is the SOC 2 report saying that AWS did this. We validated on this date. This is the range of time that's within scope. So also very handy. Any questions on that? All right, cool. So we'll play a quick game. AWS responsibility or customer responsibility? Okay. Configuring the security group rules that determine which ports are open to an EC2 Linux instance.
Customer.
All right. Prevent packet sniffing at the hypervisor level. Okay. Oh, well. Next one. Oh, hey, here we go. Shredding disk drives before they leave a data center. Yeah. And then finally, maintaining a SOC 2 report for data center control implementations. Yep. All right. Defining permissions for different. Oh man, y'all are sharp. Okay. All right. Okay. Any other questions so far before we move on?
What about rights to distribute SOC reports for AWS? run into some issues with that in our organization, where we don't have rights to do it
Yeah, talk to me afterward. I can give you some guidance on that. That's a good question.
to our customers.
Yep, definitely. That's a good question. Any others? All right. So now we will start talking about what we all came to see, the best practices. So here are the sources of the best practices in this presentation. One is the AWS Architecture Center. This is an outstanding resource. This lists different workshops, white papers, trainings, technical guides for various services focusing on security, including our best friend near and dear to my heart as an Amazonian is the well-architected framework, specifically the security pillar of the AWS well-architected framework, and also the AWS security reference architecture. So for those not familiar, there is, this has existed now I think for at least 4 or 5 years. This is a prescriptive guidance pattern on how to build out your AWS accounts following the all the best practices that I'm covering and a lot more, all the way up to enterprise scale. So highly encourage you all to take a look at that. And then the CIS benchmarks, we're all security folks here. Everyone's seen this before. The AWS Foundations, the latest version is 2.0, that was released last June. And then there's a little bit older one, the AWS 3-tier web architecture, which had 96 checks specifically for web apps, which is relevant to the scenario we're going to talk about. There's also the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework, and that identifies the 5 core security themes or security epics: identity and access management, or IAM, logging and monitoring, infrastructure security, data protection, and incident response. There's also some augmenting security themes you'll see on the right, things that are related, such as resilience, compliance, DevSecOps, things of that nature. Okay, so we'll take a look at the CIS benchmarks. So when you take a look at the CIS benchmarks, there's multiple ways you can do this. You can go to the Center for Internet Security directly, or you can also go on to the AWS documentation page, and you will see, we'll actually have the benchmarks listed on there. It's a really great resource. I like this because it's very clear. It describes what the control is, what the rationale is, the actual check itself, how to log in and actually determine whether this check is valid or not, or if it is compliant or not. And then the remediation. What do I need to do to fix this? So it puts it all in a very, very handy place. Okay. Bob and Alice, the infamous Bob and Alice. So Alice follows best practices. Bob does not follow best practices, unfortunately. So here we're going to take a look at a scenario in which Bob gets himself into a little bit of trouble, and then Alice is going to help fix it. Okay, so this is a very standard pattern in AWS Cloud and just IT in general. You have the, it's basically a multi-tier web application. So you have the web server instance within the VPC shared with an internal data service, some type of database, whether it be self-hosted or managed. And then you also have some S3 buckets that are used. One is for website images, and the other is for data backup. So the first thing that happens is an attacker takes a look at this application, and they run their suite of really cool tools, and they find out there's some vulnerabilities in this unprotected web server application. So they access it, and they compromise the underlying host, the underlying instance. From there, they find that on this instance, oh wow, within the configure folder on this, in the particular profile, there are some very privileged access keys that live on this particular instance. So I'm going to use those and start to pivot around and see what I can do within the environment. It moves to the data service. They said, hey, I'm going to cause some trouble. I'm going to delete the website image files, replace them with my own. And then finally, I'm going to change permissions to the data backup and I'm going to do some data exfiltration. Very bad situation. So stop on this real quick. This sounds pretty like elementary. Over 60% of AWS customer security events and incidents are caused by customer compromised credentials. So like the vast majority of customers that I work with, whenever there is an incident and they need us to assist, 6 times out of 10, it is related to a credential that has been exposed in a manner such as this one. So I think that that's why it's really important to kind of talk about this scenario and talk about some of the mitigations we can put in place. All right, so we're going to see what caused this. How did it get to this place? Because again, this is a pretty standard pattern, right? So first thing, there's no application-specific protection between the internet and the web server. There's no type of WAF, there's no type of firewall, there's no appliance, anything protecting that particular web server. So the attacker was able just to run a bunch of scripts until something worked. There's no segmentation. As you notice, the web server and the internal data service, they live within the same VPC, same subnet. There isn't any type of network mechanism that's going to prevent the attacker from pivoting from one place to the other. One account, this is what we call the monolith model. This is, again, is something that's fortunately very common. Again, as I mentioned previously, your AWS account serves as your security boundary. So if an attacker is able to gain access to your AWS account and they get privileged permissions, if all of your applications are running within that AWS account, what happens? Yeah, it's a bad day. Bad day. Unfortunately, it's very common. And the reason why this exists is generally what we see is most organizations, they will start with AWS in kind of like a project phase, doing some evaluations. You might do like a prototype or proof of concept, things of that nature. And guess what? We're in IT. What happens to prototypes? They become production. Somebody likes it, turns into pride. You start building on top of it. Next thing you know, you say, hey, I'm going to add some more applications. I need to talk to this application. What's the easiest thing to do? I'll throw it in the same AWS account. Maybe put it even in the same VPC. But ultimately, things start to stack up and stack up and stack up and stack up. Then a few years later, you look back and you realize you have, maybe 10, 20, 100 applications all running within the same AWS account, and you have a lot of technical debt that you need to clean up. Because ultimately, it does serve as a risk because you want to limit the blast radius of any type of potential attack such as this one.
So is the web server and the internal data service 2 separate records?
This is the same application, but it's 2 different resources in the same VPC. So it's like a web server and then like a backend database. All permissions granted. So as I mentioned, again, this is something that, when you live in the world of prototypes, innovating very quickly into production, the easiest thing to do a lot of times is use full star policies. How many people here have know what I mean when I say full star policies? Yeah, so within IAM, the easiest thing to do is, hey, I'll just grant my application permission to every service, right? Like, we'll fix it later. Later sometimes doesn't happen. An attacker compromises that credential. Yeah. Yes?
Can some of this come from cost, where they're trying to save a buck by putting out the services in one VM?
That's a good question. So there really is not, and again, I'm speaking in generalizations. I'm sure you can find an edge case, but I'm really struggling to find a case where you save money by keeping everything in one account. Because of just the way the pricing model with AWS works. If you are using an AWS organization, for example, which is a construct which allows you to organize, groups of accounts within OUs within an org, all of your billing is centralized. So if you are getting if you're using like a service like S3, for example, all the S3 billing would roll up to your organizational root account or master account. Now with that, it's actually the other way around. Most of our services, you pay as you go, and the more you use, you get discounts for using it more. So But again, if you're in the same organization, you'll get that benefit. So yeah, there really isn't one. I think a lot of it, honestly, is just technical debt, and it's just easier to do. But fortunately, things like this can happen. That's a good question. Any other questions? All right, cool. All right.
Question.
Yes, I'm sorry.
On the note of cost, don't you incur egress costs? Like, you have to be careful to make sure that the VPCs, like if you have VPC in one account and VPC in another account, if the application is talking to another one all the time, they're traversing like different VPCs, right? Doesn't that incur extra cost?
It depends. That's a good question. It depends. I think that's definitely something I want to follow up on. I'm afraid of.
I can answer that.
Yeah.
Not with VPC peering. I mean, if you have VPC peering in place, your two VPCs are connecting, and then Amazon introduced the concept of a VPC endpoint too, so that you can speak to different services without traversing the internet.
Right. Yeah. So definitely private link VPC endpoint. That's a fantastic service. But for what you're talking about two of your applications. Well, I guess you could use that with endpoints too. But two of your applications that are talking to each other, if they're within the same region, it should be minimal. But again, that's something that you definitely would need to evaluate and weigh the trade-offs. But the best practice is to, if at all possible, keep them isolated on one account per application if possible. There's also something called Transit Gateway, which simplifies that. So you can actually peer all your VPCs to like a hub and spoke model to one Transit Gateway and send everything there. Now that will incur some costs too, but cost and security are always trade-offs that you have to make. But for that specific scenario, I don't think there's much benefit as long as it's more of a regional thing. It's a great question. Great question, and thank you for the assist on that one.
Your answer to the egress point is if it leaves AWS, you'll always be charged for egress. If it leaves AWS space, now if it stays inside, like using one of the many services, several of those do have like a ridiculous cost, like 0.001 cents per gig. So you really have to have some massive stuff for it to really register. Where people are going, I saw this month's bill. It was, $3,000 more. What happened?
Yeah, and those costs are typically, and again, EC2 pricing it's something I spend a lot of time working with customers with as a TAM. It's not really in scope here, but the thing we really key in on is intra-AZ versus inter-AZ, and then region to region. Those are usually the things.
Make sure, if you're worried about it, just try and make sure it doesn't go over the internet. Like, make sure it stays within AWS.
That's definitely one thing to consider.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a whole ton of, again, so on that same architecture center with all the great security guidance, there's a ton of cost optimization guidance on there as well. So I would defer to that for your specific case, but great points. All right, and then finally, sensitive data not encrypted. So when they went to that S3 bucket, the data backup, there was nothing preventing them from actually exfiltrating that data and viewing it wherever. Didn't have any type of KMS encryption or things of that nature, so that was unfortunate. And then finally, no logging, monitoring, or alerting was in place. So Bob didn't even know he had a problem until a user reported that one of the website images was changed. Hey, what's going on our website? Why is there a picture of a pony on our corporate application? So this is something, when you hear security professionals, other security professionals talk about dwell time, this is something that you see in the cloud as well. Especially these advanced attackers, they're very, very clever, and they are good at being quiet. So making sure you have the right logging and monitoring in place will help you respond quicker in the case of a security event. So let's help Alice have a great day. Before we get into that, this is a question I get very often, so I felt like this would be good to bring up here as well. How to engage AWS support for security events. So there's various tiers of AWS support. There's basic, developer, business, and then 2 classes of enterprise support. So depending on your support level, first thing you should do, once you I don't even want to say validate that you had a security incident. But once you suspect a security event related to your AWS account, open a support case with the highest severity that your support level allows. If you're an enterprise support customer, that would be a business critical support case, which would allow you for a 15-minute targeted response time. I recommend when you open this support case through your account, select either the phone or click the chat option. Those are the best ways to get someone very quickly for a security incident. Time is of the essence. Within your support case, provide as much detail as possible. So, any accounts that are in scope, services, ARNs, which is basically the unique identifier for any principals or resources within your AWS account. The timeline. When did I first see this particular event? Do I have like a basic summary of what's going on? More information, the better. And then finally, any type of relevant logs and artifacts. If you have your own SIM tool, your own logs that you've collected, and you think that they're relevant to this, attach them to the support case, and that'll help us help you much quicker. Any questions on this? All right. So let's take a look at some of these best practices for identity and access management. One, use multiple AWS accounts to reduce the scope of impact. We talked about this. And if anyone's wondering, these numbers on the bottom are basically just markers to tell you how many times this particular statement or control is mentioned in each of those two benchmarks at the beginning. So it's 5 times in the foundation benchmark, 0 times in the web tier benchmark. Secondly, use limited roles and grant temporary security credentials. So we'll get into this. We'll do a kind of a quick overview of IAM, but there is a concept in IAM of short-term versus long-term credentials, which we'll look at, and we are always advising customers to use short-term credentials wherever possible. Federate to an existing identity service. So if you want to use something like we have AWS IAM Identity Center, formerly known as AWS SSO, that's a good option. We also support federation with other third-party identity providers, Azure AD, Okta, I mean, there's so many. But identity federation is definitely something, if you're going to have principals and users accessing your AWS resources, using identity federation is a great way to manage that and enforce specific controls. You see on there MFA. I parked behind someone that has a license plate that says use MFA. Is that person in the room? Yes, it is awesome. That is so awesome. Use MFA. All right. So AWS Identity and Access Management. So I'm going to preface this by saying that two things. AWS IAM is the foundation of security in the cloud. And I think that every other cloud service providers would say identity is the foundation there as well. It is also very, very broad and very, very deep. So I'm not going to be able to do it justice in the time allotted. So this is just a very quick, high-level overview of some of the basic concepts. And what it boils down to is who can access what. Who being the principal, whether it be a particular user or role, can access, this is the access management piece. So these are the actual policies, whether it be identity policies or resource policies within the account, and what. This is the actual resources that you are working to access. How authentication works. So basic ways, the AWS Management Console, this is what most people do. You just log in with your account information, username and password, optional MFA, recommended. I should have put strongly recommended. Use MFA, please. API and CLI access. So this is for programmatic access, or sometimes developers will use this as well. And for IAM users, this is typically access keys and secret keys. These are the long-term credentials that I was talking about. So in other IT concepts, this is just an API key, very, very basic. IAM users versus roles. So an IAM user represents a person or application. It is not a separate account. It's actually a user within your account. And depending on the method of access, you have either an individual password or you have an individual access key or long-term credentials. IAM roles, these are not tied to one individual. They can be assumed by anyone who has the permissions within the role trust policy. Anyone who needs it and has rights to it can access this particular role to perform their actions, and it uses short-term credentials. How it does this, it uses our secure token service basically to authenticate the person accessing it, and then it'll return a series of basically a key that can be used for a time that's defined by the administrator, whether I think it's up to 12 hours. So IAM roles. IAM users are I would say the legacy construct. With the various services and features that we've released, especially in the past year with like Roles Anywhere, there are decreasingly small amounts of use cases that you actually have to use a long-term credential and access key. Most applications now can use an IAM role, and even for legacy applications, we do have a service called IAM Roles Anywhere, which allows you to use an IAM role using an X509 certificate as a trust anchor. Using a role versus a user, it greatly reduces the chance of an attacker or threat actor compromising your access keys. Access keys are something that you have to manage. They're generally long-term. You have to be rotated, should be rotated. A lot of people don't. And they tend to find their ways into places that they should not be. How many people have seen access keys committed to GitHub? Yeah, happens all the time. And it's very unfortunate. If you can catch it, that's great, but I think someone ran a study. By the time the git commit hits GitHub, within about maybe 15 to 30 seconds, you're actually compromised, because threat actors know people do this, and they have tools that automate, and they just sit there and they just watch all day. They watch all the commits. They wait for something that looks like a credential, and they grab it and they nab it and they start to go to work with it. So using an IAM role will greatly mitigate the chance of that happening.
What service did you just say AWS released? IAM Anywhere?
IAM roles anywhere.
IAM roles anywhere.
Yep. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at Alice's setup and how she implemented these identity best practices into securing the application. So first thing Alice did is say, hey, you know what, let's go ahead and split this up. We are going to separate these by accounts. We're going to add some IAM permissions with MFA. We're also going to, we didn't talk about Secrets Manager. Secrets Manager is a secure storage place for credentials in your application. So as I mentioned, a lot of times folks tend to hard code access keys and credentials into applications or passwords into applications. You don't have to do that. You can use Secrets Manager to store the credential, and then you would basically just put in a parameter within your code that would point to that particular credential, and it's in a secure enclave that no one else can access. There's also another way to do this using Systems Manager Parameter Store if you want to do it a little cheaper, but you don't get some of the benefits of Secrets Manager like key rotation, things of that nature. They also took a look at implementing IAM Identity Center to do some federation. All right, any questions on identity before we get into the next piece? Yes?
How far off are you from assuming the roles of like access reviews and the things that like products like Okta or SailPoint would provide? Are you looking to get into that field, or are you going to leave that to those providers?
When you say access reviews.
Yeah, certifications, some people call them certifications. You know, where somebody has to review that you still should have that access.
Is that something that AWS would do?
Yeah, I often wonder how long it's going to be before Azure and AWS and these cloud providers just begin doing that already, since all the roles are created there anyway. So it's just seems like a simple add-on to just say, you know, access review from within. I mean, they already can to some degree, but they're still more basic than.
Yeah, I think I see where you're going. Like something like so there's two ways you can do that now. So the question was about doing access reviews on credentials, which is a best practice, is not covered here. But basically reviewing, you know, I think quarterly is usually the industry standard, reviewing all the credentials and the users to make sure those people still need that level of access. So there's two ways to do this. One is there is a credential report you can access directly from the IAM service. So any type of users and credentials, whether they be passwords or access keys, they will be listed within this report, and it will tell you when they were created, when's the last time they were changed, and when's the last time they were used. So that's a great way to do it. Second way is through IAM Access Advisor, because as mentioned, that covered users. IAM Access Advisor has the same type of information for roles. The other great thing that IAM Access Advisor also has is it'll show you for a particular role not only what a principal has permissions to, but what are they actually using? Is this role is this role over provisioned, which is something very important when we start talking about least privilege. So those are two ways, but anything beyond that, if you have any feedback or recommendations, I'd be happy to hear that. Great question. Anything else on identity? All right. Logging and monitoring, best practices. Turn on logging in all accounts for all services in all regions. The highlighted services here are CloudTrail and GuardDuty. We'll talk about a little bit what they can do. This is something that a lot of folks will say, hey, our friend US East 1, hey, I'm only in US East 1. Why do I need to enable CloudTrail and GuardDuty in all regions? That's because threat actors know that everybody uses US East 1. So if I'm going to compromise an AWS account, I'm not going to go to US East 1, and let's say I want to mine Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency. I'm not going to go into US East 1. Everyone's there. You'll see me within 5 minutes. I might go to one of the APJC regions or one of the Europe regions and work over there. And if there's no type of GuardDuty or CloudTrail or any type of monitoring set up in those particular regions, because again, these services are regional, like most of our services, I can be undetected for that much longer. So please enable CloudTrail. CloudTrail, you get a free trail by default, so just enable that. And then GuardDuty, there is a cost associated with that. I think we estimate it to be anywhere from 0.5 to 1% of your account spend, because it goes based off of activity within the account, which especially as you grow and scale, the benefit to having it turned on is so much greater. But we'll talk about what that does here in a minute.
Rather than enabling CloudTrail, wouldn't it be better, because this is manual, it's better to create a cloud security policy and apply it to everything, so that you ensure?
Yes. So
That's not Alice, it would be like Charles, right, do that.
So the answer to that is both. You will want the preventative control, and then you will want the detective control. So the preventative control would be a policy like an IAM policy, or if you're using organizations, a service control policy or an SCP, you can apply it to your whole org. But you also want to be able to investigate and determine what your users are doing. So from an operational standpoint, it's really handy, but from a security standpoint, it's absolutely crucial. We'll talk about that, but that's a good question. Thank you. All right. Use the AWS platform's built-in monitoring and alerting features. Security Hub is probably my favorite service. We'll talk about that here in a minute. AWS Config is also an awesome service. This is, frankly, the state recorder. AWS Config. It doesn't just log it. When you enable AWS Config, you can actually monitor the state of all the supported resources within your accounts, and then you can determine when their configuration changed and by whom. And you can also set alarms if a configuration is falling outside of a particular policy you define. So a good example of an AWS config rule is for an EC2 instance security group, making sure that port 22 is not available from the public internet. That's something that you can set an AWS config rule for very easily, and you will be notified and an alarm will go off if somebody goes in and starts messing around with things. You can tell them, hey, don't do that. You could even set it as an automated remediation workflow, so that a Lambda function will automatically change the rule back to what you wanted in the first place. That's the advanced way to do it, but definitely recommend it. Right. Use a separate AWS account to fetch and store copies of all logs. So we talk about the multi-account model. Within the security reference architecture, there's a recommendation to have a dedicated security OU within this OU or organizational unit, you would have your security investigations account, you would have your security tooling account, and you would also have a dedicated logging account. Does anyone know why you would have your logs in a separate account from your workloads?
So if it gets compromised, they can't erase the traces.
Exactly. So you want to, again, we're talking about limiting the blast radius, right? You want to make sure that if someone does compromise one of your applications, a lot of times what we'll see when we're taking a look at the CloudTrail logs, the first thing that a threat actor will do is they will look to mess with the logs. They'll either disable the logging, or they'll go in and then try to overwrite them, or they'll try to do some things to obfuscate their tracks. So having that in a separate account is a really great way to protect against that. And you can also turn on file integrity validation or hashing within logs that are stored for S3 to add another control to make sure they haven't been tampered with or modified for integrity purposes. Okay. All right, CloudTrail. So CloudTrail, the most important log source in AWS. This logs all API actions performed within an AWS account. So when you're in AWS, whether you're using the console, the CLI, or the API connection, everything is an API call. CloudTrail records all of it. It'll tell you who performed the action, when it occurred, where it happened, particular region, what is the specific action, which resources and any type of like additional parameters are in place, and the results of the action, whether it was successful or if there was an error. So this is going to be, if you're troubleshooting issues from a IT standpoint, this is very useful. From a security standpoint, this is critical because this is the history, these are the footprints of every activity that happened within your account. Here's an example of some sample logs on the right. I don't know if you can see that, but basically it's JSON, very standard syntax. In this particular case, you would have the identity at the top that performed the action, the ARN of that identity, the account ID, the access key that was used, any type of additional context. If MFA was enabled, in this case it was not, the time the event occurred, and then what the actual action was, the source IP address, which is really handy if you're talking about trying to see if this came from inside or outside the network or from a known malicious IP, and then there are any type of request parameters. And then finally, the response elements, whether this action succeeded or not. This is absolutely, again, I can't emphasize this enough, just because I've been involved in a lot of these types of investigations lately, having these CloudTrail records and having them in a place where people know how to view them, having practice viewing them, practice retrieving and viewing them as part of your incident response plan, absolutely critical. Best practices for CloudTrail. So if you have an organization, you can create an org trail and apply it to all regions. You can also, again, talk about log file integrity, make sure they're not tampered with, and then logging to a dedicated account in a centralized S3 bucket with least privilege, MFA delete, and then you can do object lifecycle management on that as well. So you're not retaining those logs and paying for them forever. You can phase them out after 3 years, 7 years, depending on the time of your organization. All right. So you say, hey, that's all well and good, but that's a lot of logs to look through. How can I simplify this a little bit? So Amazon Guard Duty. Amazon Guard Duty is our foundational intrusion detection service for AWS, for the AWS control plane. So what Guard Duty does is it consumes data from various sources such as VPC flow logs, DNS logs, any type of account login events, CloudTrail events, S3 data plane events if you opt in, and then there's some other opt-in areas as well. It has, we added malware protection in Guard Duty. There's protection for Lambda functions. There's protection for EKS workloads, Elastic Kubernetes Service workloads. But at the core of it, what it does is it baselines your account. It takes a look at all the API activity once it's enabled. Then after a set of days, it understands what is normal within the account and what might not be normal within the account. It builds a model, and then it continuously gains information from various threat intelligence feeds, some that AWS develops, some that our partners develop, and it will notify you if there's anything that looks like any type of suspicious or anomalous event within your account. So you're getting the fact of, hey, we're getting threat signatures that are updated by the second, but we're also getting analysis of any type of activity that say, hey, you know what? This user, Brandon Rooks, he was logging in from Raleigh, North Carolina all this time, and then how is he simultaneously logged in from Raleigh, North Carolina, Paris, France, and North Korea all at the same time? But that's not really possible. And he's usually accessing this service S3, but now all of a sudden he's making API calls to IAM and trying to create users and attach policies and remove policies. Why is he doing that? GuardDuty will flag that for you. If you take a look at the GuardDuty page, there's at least, I don't even know how many findings on there, organized into finding groups, but the findings are actionable, and they have the information that you need to identify the attacks and respond to them a lot quicker. It is also fully integrated with other AWS services such as Detective, which is our investigation service, threat intel investigation service, Security Hub, as I mentioned before, and then Event Bridge, which can be used to set off automated notification and response workflows. Okay, any questions on GuardDuty? Yes?
You still have to run a GuardDuty instance for every region, correct?
Yes, GuardDuty is a regional service, so it does need to be enabled in every region, and that's actually, as I mentioned, the best practice is to, sorry, my mic's going in and out, is to enable it in all regions that you use, in all regions, actually. Great question. So one question I had is like, okay, well, GuardDuty is regional. You showed me a slide, there's 30-something regions. Do I have to log into GuardDuty and click through each region every day to see if there's bad stuff going on in my account? No, you don't have to. We have Security Hub. So Security Hub is an awesome service. It serves as the centralized pane of glass for findings from various AWS security services such as GuardDuty, Inspector, Macy, which is our data protection service, as well as other partner services. So things like Qualys, CrowdStrike, Tenable. They also support Security Hub where they can push findings to that as well. So if you're a security analyst, you have the ability to go in and see everything in one simple place, along with the remediations. Other awesome thing that Security Hub does is it is a cloud security posture management service. So it leverages rules from AWS config that we talked about before, and it allows you to set a baseline for your account that adheres to either the CIS benchmarks, PCI DSS, NIST 853, or the AWS Foundational Best Practice Standard, and you can see whether your account is compliant or the resources are compliant with the handy percentage on things you need to fix to align your account with the best practice. That is a very simple and straightforward way to, you can go home tonight, you can turn on Security Hub, you'll get the free 30 days, and you can baseline your account within hours, and you can see how you measure up against those best practices. It also has integration with our Trusted Advisor service, which we didn't talk about. There's some other free security checks built in as well. So once you have that, say, okay, great, it aggregates everything. It can aggregate all your GuardDuty findings from all your regions into one particular region, so you have one place to look for it. What then? You have integration with, again, Trusted Advisor and other services, AWS Audit Manager. But the best thing, I would say, the most underrated thing that Security Hub does is it can serve as that centralized hub, pun intended, to trigger any type of remediation actions. So if you have a Lambda function or a systems manager runbook, you can have it so that if you see a particular finding, you can automatically respond to it. So one way you could do this is say, hey, in this scenario, I have a web server that's compromised, and if there is a critical finding for this particular web server, I want to quarantine it immediately. If I have something that's related to, let's say if there's a ransomware finding on this particular web instance, I want to quarantine it to isolate it from the rest of my internal network. Very straightforward to do with Security Hub. You can also have it alert you via PagerDuty, Slack, other partner services. Any questions on Security Hub? Right. So this is an example of the automated security best practice standard. And again, there's over 150. We update these every month. Okay, so now we're going to look at this environment with these controls in place. We have config, guard duty, CloudTrail, and CloudWatch enabled. And that's going to give us some more insight as to what's going on. Infrastructure security. So create a threat prevention layer using AWS Edge services. So CloudFront is our content delivery network or CDN service. This basically will sit at the edge and allow you to, from a performance standpoint, put your application and your data closer to customers wherever they are across the world. But it also serves as another protective layer between your users and your application. AWS Shield is our denial of service or DDoS mitigation service. All accounts get Shield Standard for free. It's already turned on. You don't know it's there, but it's working for you. There's also Shield Advanced, which gives you some more advanced protection, and then different types of response with our dedicated security response team. DDoS security response team. There's also AWS WAF, which is our web application firewall service, which is, having this WAF or a WAF is very much recommended if you have a public-facing web application. Yes?
I have a question. How do you help your clients determine whether it's appropriate to use your native services, features, and security functions versus a third party?
How do we do that? We look at the use case. So my goal again is I'll speak from my role. I'm a technical account manager. There are plenty of times where a partner application or service fits the customer needs much better. The benefit of using AWS service is the clean and tight-knit integration with the other AWS services, but a lot of partner services have it as well. So how do I do it is I work with the customer, I work backwards from what they need, and we find the best tool for it. Yes?
So just one more thing, and it's just a plug for AWS. So I work for F5, but what I can tell you is at F5 and many of the manufacturers you're already working with, you can purchase our services through AWS, not only for AWS, but for other cloud providers. So for those of you who are in multi-cloud environments and are using AWS and Azure and on-prem, for example, F5 and many of the other manufacturers, you can purchase on AWS cheaper, by the way, than any other way to consume these products and use these products in other environments. So I just wanted to point that out, that is unique to AWS, and there may be a cost savings opportunity which can scale across multi-cloud environments for you.
Yep, definitely. And if you are an enterprise, if you purchase that through, if you purchase a partner application or product service through Marketplace, that would apply towards your enterprise commitment as well. The other cool thing with F5 specifically and WAF, you can actually purchase rules on the Marketplace created by F5 for WAF. So WAF has the AWS managed rules that you can purchase. But you can also, F5 has managed rules you can purchase. If you say, hey, you know what, I'm used to using F5 rules, I like this syntax, I like the way this works, you can get them directly from there. So yeah, AWS Marketplace, thank you for calling that out. AWS Marketplace is a great resource for other security services as well. Okay, creating network zones with VPCs and security groups. Security group is basically a host-based firewall for your EC2 instance and EC2 instances, and VPC is your virtual private cloud. It's just a representation of your networking, your network boundary within AWS for a particular set of applications. So making sure that there's also a concept on here called NACLs or network ACLs. They can also be used to segment, but ultimately creating security zones for different tiers of your application. That's really what this boils down to. Your web tier should be separate from your application tier, which should be separate from your database tier. Manage vulnerabilities through patching and scanning. So Inspector is listed, but as mentioned, there are a number of awesome partner services that I'm sure you all are familiar with. Qualys, Tenable, Rapid7, I don't want to name them all. Forgive me if I forgot one, but please just scan and patch. Whether it be an EC2 instance, whether it be a container, Lambda functions can be scanned as well. So please implement scanning and patching. In this particular scenario, had there been some scanning and patching in place, that web server probably wouldn't have been compromised. We could have avoided this bad situation. So we now have security groups in place. We also have separate isolated VPCs in place, not isolated, but separate VPCs in place. We have WAF and Shield to add additional layers of protection along with CloudFront now on the edge. And then Inspector to scan regularly and let us know if there are any vulnerabilities that need to be remediated. Okay, that leads us to data protection. So encrypt, encrypt, encrypt. Encrypt data at rest with occasional exceptions. The exception being that if it is, if you consider this 100% public, I guess technically you wouldn't have to. I probably argue that from a security standpoint, but hey, enable encryption at rest. We offer the ability to do server-side encryption for a lot of our AWS services using our key management server, so AWS KMS, and then encrypt data in transit everywhere. It's really straightforward. You can use services such as Certificate Manager to set up your own certificates for any type of instance-to-instance secure implementations. But encrypting data in transit is something that we really value. If you've been with AWS, you'll know that we have recently deprecated all versions below TLS 1.2 on all of our AWS service endpoints. So now, if you're talking with the AWS Service API, you have to use TLS 1.2 or greater. A lot of them are being onboarded to TLS 1.3 if your organization supports it. There are some security and performance benefits to doing that as well. But ultimately, no matter what you do, you shouldn't send anything over plain text over the internet. It's just not in 2024. Okay, so here we have some data protection in place, and this will bring us to our call to action in the summary. Number one, multi-account strategy, short-term credentials, and least privilege. Least privilege, least privilege. We didn't talk about least privilege too much. A great service that will help you with this is IAM Access Analyzer. It does two cool things. One, it will tell you if any of your resources are exposed outside of your zone of trust. You can define that zone of trust as either your AWS account or your AWS organization. Number two, which I think is really cool, is it will generate secure policies for you. You can point it at a particular role and say, okay, what is everything that this role accessed within the past 7 days? It will take a look at that and it will craft a starter IAM policy for you at a least privilege level. Identity federation, enable logging, use monitoring and alerting features, use dedicated accounts for security and log storage, protect your applications at the edge, segment your network zones, patch and scan and patch, manage vulnerabilities, encrypt everywhere, and engage AWS support immediately when you suspect a security incident. Now's the time if anyone has any additional questions. Yeah.
Any concern with scan provisioning where you're setting up user groups in like Azure and scan provisioning the members of those groups too with Amazon Cloud?
No, that's a supported method. We have a lot of documentation on that.
You guys provide any renting services?
You mean like through professional services? I want to say that we do. I don't have the details on that. But yeah, we do have security assessment services as part of ProServe. So I'll definitely talk to your account manager or your TAM for details on that. Yep.
Can you show that picture a couple slides back that had all the solutions on it? Thank you.
Yep.
It's really necessary to separate the database in a separate account, given that it's one workload?
Not entirely. Good question. Any other questions? All right. Well, I think we are approaching the top of the hour. I would really like to thank you all for this opportunity. This has been awesome. This is my first time speaking to this group. I've been an ISSA member for a long time, and this was great. I really love the interaction and the feedback. It's made me feel really good about it, made me a lot less nervous. So thank you all very much. If you'd like to reach out to me, there's email, LinkedIn. Thank you.